We begin with the scene. Your sensei scowls in your direction, his arms crossed, lowering his head in disappointment.
Tristan, how many times have I told you? Patience is a key virtue of martial arts. Well, the Cogheart was in trouble.
Your sensei lowers his arms and shakes his head before looking to the Cogheart.
Tristan, everyone, this isn't over yet. Stances!
The sounds of maniacal laughing can be heard from the opposite side of the Cogheart.
You thought those silly glatter clowns were my only plan? I won't stop until this joke of false hope is destroyed forever.
You see Caspar fumbling with the device and hearing the sound of clicking alongside an audible clock ticking down.
Sayonara, my friends.
A flash of smoke, Caspar has vanished. We transition to a conflict scene. Rolling an initiative group check of dexterity and insight and scoring a 12, you act first. Trusting your class and sensei to handle Caspar, you run towards the device and quickly assess it, realizing you will need to figure out a way to deactivate it before the timer expires. You close your eyes and meditate briefly, then perform an attribute check using insight and willpower. Your first results are 5 and 7, which fail the action difficulty. You take another moment, focusing on the calm in your mind before performing a final action score, a 6, which fails. Knowing that the Cogheart stands at the center of this town and provides energy to all its residents, you choose to invoke a bond through loyalty and affection for the Cogheart. You do this by spending 1 Fabula point and increase the total by 2 up to 8, which succeeds. After a few moments, you are able to deactivate the device, stopping threats to the Cogheart. Though Caspar has also escaped. Again.
Welcome in, Shield Brothers and Shield Maidens, to Shield's Rest. I'm Brown, I'm here with Fry, and if you haven't checked out our first video for Fabula Ultima, Chapter 1 Introduction, please do so. However, in this video, Chapter 2, we're going to be looking at the game's framework, and we're going to start by talking about the narrative landscape.
Right, so what the narrative landscape kind of boils down to is what the game calls scenes. So a scene is just any time there is a focus on a event, specifically the PCs, but there are certain scenes that don't involve the PCs, which we'll get into. But in general, when there's a reference to a scene, that is just where the characters are basically on a stage, right? This is where the game master kind of describes what's going on, what is the situation, what is around us, and that is what the characters will act in. And then once that scene is over, the conflict is resolved. The game master will declare, hey, the scene is over. We're now going to move on to what's next. This is important because there are going to be abilities, particularly spells, that are scene dependent. They'll say once per scene, or maybe at the end of this scene, something happens. So it's just important to know when a scene begins and ends, just for abilities and spells. So the first scene we'll talk about is a conflict scene. So this is just what it sounds like. It's a conflict scene. It could be a battle, it could be a chase, it could just be a tense social situation with another NPC. And all this is just a zoom in on the characters in this specific time and place to track what they're doing in greater detail. And then next up, we have the interlude scene. So I would think of this as kind of like a cutscene or a montage of just things that are going on over a long period of time that you don't necessarily need to get into the finer details about. Those kind of slow pace things, right? You're going over a large trek, maybe over water or over some plains. You're descending down into a cave or a dungeon that's going to take a few hours that you don't really need to get the finer details on. Maybe even resting in a town overnight, or even like a month long wait. Maybe you're trying to wait for an ally to recover, or you're trying to wait for a key moment to happen. And it's going to be like, a couple of weeks or months from now. That's all an interlude scene is. And you're just describing, hey, what are we going to be doing over this large period of time or this segment of time? You can do things like projects and describing journeys as well, which are two things we'll get into a little bit later. But that's all these are. Just think of them like cutscenes, montage, that you're just describing what the characters are doing during this time. Finally, you have the game master scene. So these are scenes that actually don't involve the player characters. The player characters are merely spectators to this. They are separated from the scene, and as the game master getting a chance to maybe foreshadow events, introduce future threats, or show what a villain's doing kind of off screen. You're not always going to interact with the BBEG, right? The big bad evil guy. And this is the chance for the game master to say, hey, while you were doing all this is what the villain has been doing in the background. Think of it again as kind of like a cutscene, but it's not one involving your character. It's kind of you getting to see what is going on outside of the scope of your characters. And then that leads into sessions. So a session is just the combination of all the scenes into one session where you sit down with the other players and the game master. For Fabula Ultima, they kind of assume a 4-hour session, so to speak. So again, something to keep in mind because there are even abilities and stuff that are once a session or refreshed every session. So if you're going for a big long day, like an 8-hour session, you're just pounding through just to make sure you're tracking those things because sometimes you do need to refresh those for every session, so to speak. And then all of those sessions equal your campaign. For Fabula Ultima, they assume a campaign is anywhere from 20 to 50 sessions to just get a good storyline chunk in it. But feel free to take it longer, make it shorter, whatever works best for you. There are actually rules for faster advancement if you want to do a shorter campaign, but still want to get all the levels in and all the cool things that you can do in Fabula Ultima. They have rules for that in the game, which I think is really cool. And then for this last one, we'll throw them up on the screens here. There are some kind of like, special important rules that are specific to Fabula Ultima. The one things I do want to call out in particular is the kind of math rules for the game. This one, if you have multiple operations that come up in the game, you always add, then subtract, then multiply, then divide. So I like that it specifies what order you're supposed to do things in. It's not your typical math order. So just pay attention to that thing there. And then also pay close attention to timing things. So it does specify when the player takes precedence, when the enemies kind of take precedence and all that. Just make sure you're keeping track of those. It does actually give you kind of a breakdown of who goes when or what triggers what in what order, which I do appreciate. I always love when they specify, hey, if all these things are happening at once, this is kind of the order and this is who chooses, so to speak. So there's a list of rules specifically for the game, but those two in particular I wanted to call out because I think they're important, they're cool, and I'm glad that they added those kind of into the game there.
I really like the scenes in this game. The concept of that is pretty much in every tabletop role playing game. At least, I realize that now, but reading through this, it kind of breaks it down into those chunks where the whole table can understand where you're at what time. And I think for certain brains, right, and certain personalities, I think that will help to keep them on point with each other and help them role play because they know if they're in a conflict scene, everybody's in conflict, right? So I do think it's helpful the way that the scenes are played out in this game. And math is not my strong suit either, so it's good that it spells it out for you. Always gotta love that.
Yeah, I love that it also sets the framework of like, oh, I know I can use these abilities right now because I'll refresh at the end of this. You don't have to worry about holding on to the
Hmm,
ability to use it at the perfect moment because you don't know when you're gonna get a rest in or anything like that. So
right.
that's what I like most about the scene concept of it is, hey, I know I'm gonna get this ability back in just a minute, so let
Yeah.
me go ahead and use it now while it's relevant.
So you like the meta game. You like to know when you can meta
Yeah,
game. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
I'll jump over a little bit into the character's blueprint, right? And so basically, this is the part of the book that talks about the anatomy of the character, and I'll throw the character sheet up, and we'll kind of follow along in that path. And again, I'm just gonna kind of touch on some of these things and describe them in small detail. In the future videos, we're gonna actually build a character and maybe even do some play with it. So we'll talk more specific. If we feel like we're skimming anything here, just look at our future videos to get the depth. But first, obviously, on your character sheet is going to be your name, right? That could be whatever you'd like it to be. But the most important things, and we mentioned this in the first chapter as well, for a character, is going to be your traits. Now, your traits consist of three different things. First of which is your identity, right? So think of Tristan in our entrance scenes. He's a martial artist, so that's his identity. He identifies as a martial artist. And then you have your theme for him as well. I've chosen the theme justice, right? He really wants to bring villains to, to justice. And then his origin is he's from Cog's Hollow, which you haven't seen that yet, but that's kind of the name of the place where we're doing these scenarios, where the Cog's heart is. And so that's his origin. So those three things make up your character. And we'll talk a little bit more about the traits here in just a second. Next up, we have bonds. I like bonds in this game because it's very interesting. You have, we use that in our example, actually, with the cog heart. But the way that you can invoke a bond is you have certain emotions, right? And there's three different pairs of emotions. So the ones that are paired together are admiration or inferiority. That's one pair. Then you have loyalty or mistrust. That's the second pair. And then you have affection or hatred. So you can see those are kind of opposing. That's the third pair. And with bonds, you can have up to 6 bonds total at any time, and you can only have a maximum of 3 emotions tied to any one of those bonds. Uh, we'll talk about this a little bit later in the video when we come to resting, but that's where you can create, modify, or erase what bonds you have or how they're working. You can also use your Fabula points. So one Fabula point, like we did in the scenario, you can invoke that to add the bonus from your bond. So depending on how many emotions you have tied to the bond you're using, that's how many plus you get to the skill roll. So in our example, we used 2 different bonds. We get a +2 to the skill roll, which helped Tristan to exceed in what he was doing. And next on the character sheet, we have Fabula points. We'll go more into those in another video. However, those are where you keep track of your Fabula points. You also have experience points, which is based on how you will maintain your levels and level up in this game. And then we have your initiative modifier, which is just like it is in most games. That's how fast you're willing to act, what bonus you might have to that ability. Then you have your defense. Again, it's your ability to avoid being hit and dodge blows or absorb damage. And then you have magic defense, which is your ability to anticipate and resist spells or magical effects. And next we have the attributes. So you may have seen in our examples in the last video and this one, but there are 4 total attributes. We have dexterity, or dex, which is your finesse and reflexes. You have insight, or ins, ins, which is understanding and reasoning. You have might, which is mig, or mig, which is your strength and fortitude. And willpower, or wilp, WLP, which is charisma or discipline. And willpower also influences your mind points, so if you're playing a caster, that's a little bit more important to you. Also on the character sheet is your hit points, your ability to withstand pain or fatigue, mind points, which are your focus and concentration, and that's what you use to cast your spells, and inventory points. Inventory points are an abstract resource you can use to create on-the-spot items. Think like consumables, like a potion, or just something that might fit the scenario in the moment that you have it. And we'll go more into inventory points in the next chapter. However, those are very useful, and I love that this system has that. It's like the make-believe of this game. That's really great. You can like have whatever you want whenever you need it, with limitations. We also have your class and your skill levels, which you start at level 5. You have to pick at least 2 classes. You can go up to 3. And then your skill levels, depending on which class you did choose, there are certain skills that you may be able to get more than once in that skill. And if the skill has a limit, it will have it identified, and I'll throw that up to show you what it looks like. You also have your equipment and your backpack, and then your zenit, or zenit, I'm not sure how to say it, but that's the money in this game. Those are all on the first page of the character sheet. Second and third pages has your arcana and your spells, and then also your rituals and heroic skills, which we'll get into all of those in a future chapter. That's the character sheet. That's what makes up your character. And then Fry is going to talk about the action system and how we use our character.
For your actions, are typically always going to be some form of check, right? Um, as we did in our scenario, right? We did check to try and defuse that bomb, whatever. Everything's just going to be called a check. And when you roll a check is, either required by the game rules, such as casting a spell, making an attack, using a class skill, things like that will require a check. And then, of course, when the game master asks for a check. So if you're trying to, jump over a ravine or try and scale a wall that is difficult, right? Those are pretty much the 2 times you're going to make the checks like that. And then when we make a check, it's always going to be 2 dice that are rolled, and it's going to be the dice that are associated with the attributes used for the check. So, like we did in our scenario there, we had insight and willpower to try and defuse the bomb. And then it's whatever dice size is associated with that attribute. Again, we'll go into that a little more in depth when we do the character creation side of it and going into those. But basically, you assign a die size to your attribute. So instead of having, a 3 in insight or a 4 in insight, you'll have a d6 in insight and a d10 in willpower. And that's how those are the dice you will roll when those checks are called for. And in the scenarios where maybe only dexterity makes sense, you'll just roll your dexterity die twice. So it's always two dice, just sometimes you might use the stat twice instead of using two different stats. There are some common checks and associated attributes in the book. However, the narrative is first, right? So if you can say, hey, I know for this check it's normally maybe dex and willpower, but I think I can use it with might and willpower, and this is why. And if it makes sense, the game encourages that. You use the attributes that make sense for your character, which I think is really cool. It's got a lot of flexibility in how you can use the attributes assigned to your character. As far as kind of terminology goes with the checks, you have your modifiers. So sometimes you'll have a bonus or a penalty to the check, and that'll just be, a +2 or a -2 depending on what it is and what the source is. Then you have your difficulty level, and that is the number you are trying to beat. You have to either get greater than or equal to that number to succeed. And then sometimes you'll need to know what your high roll is. So that is just whenever you roll the two dice, say you roll a d8 and d10, and the dice show a 6 and a 9, the high roll for the check will be the 9. So it's just whatever you rolled higher on either die. Some abilities, typically weapons and some spell damage, will specify that you need to know what your high roll is and what to do with it. And then, of course, you have your critical successes. So a critical success is whenever you roll a double six or higher. So either double six, double seven, double eight. It has to be the same number on both die, and it has to be at minimum a six to be considered a critical success. Whenever you get a critical success, whatever you're doing automatically succeeds, and you get to apply the effect of an opportunity, which we'll throw up on the screen there and get into a little bit here in a second. And what's next is you have a fumble. So this is when both die during the check roll a 1. This is the opposite of a critical success. This is a critical failure, basically. Whatever you're doing fails automatically no matter what, not necessarily due to your incompetence, but because of an unfortunate twist. And with a fumble, the opposition now gets to have an opportunity. However, there is a little bit of silver lining. Whenever you roll a fumble, you immediately gain a Fabula point. So one of those, if you wanted to, add a extra score to a roll, like we did in our example there, you'll get a point to be able to do that, among other things. Again, we'll go into all those options later on. But as far as the opportunities go, it's just a nice little bonus you get with whatever the check is, right? You could get advantage, so the next check you perform by you or an ally can receive a +4 bonus. You can get a lost item, so an item is destroyed, lost, stolen, or left behind. You can scan, so you can discover a vulnerability or a trait of a creature you can see. So you just get these nice little bonuses on top of the check whenever you critically succeed, and whenever you fumble, your opposition can get these opportunities against you. So I really like those. I thought that was a really cool little system to have. So instead of just, oh, you critically succeed, okay, you just get what you want. Now you actually get some bonuses now, and you can pick. You get to pick which one you do. It's not just you get a random one as well. So there's a lot of flexibility in what you're allowed to do with your success. And you never know what you're going to get when you fumble, because your GM might, come in with something crazy that you weren't expecting. So.
Yeah, I really like the opportunity system. I thought that was super cool because, I mean, getting a critical is already exciting, but this is a way to really like you get to pick how it affects, and you have that chart, to help you. But I thought that was super cool and unique. I haven't seen that in other tabletop games that we've covered just yet. So I'll talk a little bit more too about the mechanics and detail. So, like back to what you were talking about with performing an attribute check, for example. The book outlines a 7-step process of what this means, and I'm going to cheat a little bit. I got the book right here, but the first step is that the character performing the check states what their goal is, right? What are they trying to accomplish? And then step 2 is how they're going to approach the situation and how they intend to reach their goal, right? So going back to step 1. The game master usually chooses, like Fry said, what the attributes are that will be used. However, that's kind of open for discussion. It's, narration first, right? Step 3 is going to be the game master sets a difficulty difficulty level. This is not Dungeons and Dragons. Sets a difficulty level. The difficulty levels starts at 7, right? As easy, for example. 10 is normal. 13 is hard. 16 is very hard. Now, like Fry said, the maximum you can have on your attributes is 12. So let's say perfect scenario, you're rolling double 12s. I mean, your max potential there is a 24. So kind of hard to get a 16 in most situations, especially if you're not using your two prime attributes. So usually the middle of the road is like a 10 if you're unsure, but if you really just want your characters to be able to, you want your player characters to be able to succeed, 7 is the easy way to do that. Step number 4 is applying any modifiers they might have to their role. So if they do invoke a trait or a bond or something like that, or there's a situational modifier. And then number 5 is if determining a fumble or critical, which Fry's already covered. Number 6 is if it's greater than the difficulty level, then you succeed. If it's lower, then you fail. And number 7 is did they achieve their goal or did things take a turn for the worse? And there's more information on that later in the system, but that pretty much covered it all. So invoking a trait, right? Let's say you want to, like our scenario, and trait and a bond are kind of the same in a sense, where you can spend 1 Fabula point to initiate those. However, if you remember when I first talked about the anatomy of a character, the traits, right? So Tristan, he has the trait of a martial artist. So if it was some scenario where he had to prove his skill or best another classmate or something, he could probably invoke his trait of martial artist to show off or to improve what he's trying to do through something martial arts related. He could also use his theme of justice to try to, pull that deep-seated justice out of him and really overcome whatever he's facing. And alternatively, using a bond, kind of like we did in this scenario, if you're tied to your hometown, your cog heart, you know how it's important. You have a love and affection for it because it's, the source of how you live. Something like that can be invoked through a bond, for example. And then situational modifiers are +2 or -2. Like Fry said, you kind of use those where the story demands it. The book specifically mentions that there are some times where a specific difficulty level is given, but if somebody's doing something really extra or impresses you or the opposite, then you can use a situational modifier to give that bonus or penalty, whether they invoked a trait or a bond or added anything else in or not. So it's definitely, like Fry said, narration first. This game is supposed to flow narratively. You're supposed to feel like you're in the story and you're driving it. That's why this whole Fabula Ultima situation is you're setting the world at session 0 with each other. You're identifying who you are, where you are, what the whole land is like. It's really narration first. And because of that, you are going to play as a group, hopefully, to the best of your ability, which Fry will talk about some group-related things here, maybe.
Right, yeah. So there are, just to like round out the kind of checks that there are, right? You do have the group checks. So whenever there is a situation where you're going to all support each other in trying to achieve that goal or get a success in a specific situation, you can do a group check. So what you'll do is there are steps for this in the book, which, just a sidebar, that's what I love a lot about this book is whenever there is things that are super involved, they usually have some kind of step process in here to smooth out whatever it is you're trying to do. So we'll throw that one up there as well. But you'll basically nominate a leader. This is who's going to perform like the final check or the main check, and this will be the person who determines the action's outcome. Everybody else is just a supporting character in that. So everybody who is supporting will do a support check that is identical to what the leader will perform, but they have a fixed difficulty of 10. Fumbles and critical successes during those checks do not generate opportunities, but they still do count as automatic failures and successes. And every supporting character who is successful in their check grants a +1 bonus to the leader's check. And if any of the supporting characters have a bond towards the leader, the highest strength amongst those bond is also added to the leader's check. But only that single highest bond. It's not everybody's bond, so to speak. It's just whoever has the highest point total towards that leader gets to add that bonus. And then finally, the leader performs their check. Um, Going back to that previous checklist for all that, and then looking for opportunities with fumbles and critical successes and things like that. So you group checks do matter. They do actually add a lot to the checks themselves, which I think is really cool. You actually get to help as opposed to just giving advantage or something like that. You'll see in other games they actually get to roll, show how they're supporting, and then actually add bonuses. And again, back to those bonds. Bonds play a heavy role in this game, which I think is really cool. And then just to round out the kind of other checks that we have here, we have opposed checks. So this is whenever, instead of just attacking back and forth. Maybe you guys are in a grappling situation. I think the example in the book uses you're fighting a dragon has a hold on you, so you're trying to break free of his grip, and so that is just whatever your check is versus their check. The GM will declare what stats are used. They should match each other, and then it's just a roll off. Whoever gets higher wins that opposed check. If you both roll the same, you just re-roll, and then if you both critically fail, or sorry, critically succeed, or both fumble, and that just counts as the same of you just re-rolling because you've matched it. You also have open checks. So this is where there's no difficulty level per se. This is just seeing how good you are at performing said tasks. So maybe you're just trying to scale a wall. We know you can scale the wall, but maybe you're trying to see how fast you can do it, or how much effort it takes, right? Or maybe you're trying to cook a meal. Everybody can cook a meal, but how well can you cook the meal? So this is just a normal roll, normal check as always, but there's not a difficulty level. However, it does have a table on, depending on your score, how well you succeeded at that task. 7 being like any person with a little bit of training could have done this, all the way up to that 16 plus, where this is a piece of work that will be remembered throughout history, right? So open check, that's all it is, just normal, but without the difficulty level. You're just seeing how well you are at doing something. And then you will use all those checks to try and succeed at completing or preventing a clock like you saw in the scenario we opened with from completing. You're trying to work towards that clock, and I'll let Brown get into that a little bit. I love the clock system. I think it's really cool. I'm probably implement
Yeah.
it myself, but I'll let you get into it.
Basically, what Fry's trying to say is this is where you're trying to win the game, right?
Yeah,
Using all those checks to win the game. That's the whole purpose of this. Narration first, but you're trying to win the game. Yeah, no, so basically there's many different ways that you can use clocks in this game. The book says it goes anywhere from a 4 to 12 section clock, right? So think about a pie chart. I'll throw that up there. But in our scenario, what I was thinking of using that was basically a time clock where you have, there's 4 sections that are counting down, and as long as you succeed at least once before the clock expires, then you successfully accomplish the goal. That's kind of how the opening scenario was in my mind. However, to advance a clock, normally you fill one section for a success, or 1 section for a failure. And if you pass the check by 3 or more, then you fill in an additional section, or if you pass the check by 6 or more, you fill in 2 sections. So, and same works for a failure. If you fail by 3 or more, it's 1. If you fail by 6 or more, it's 2. So you can see how if you're using like a 4 section clock, for example, it can go pretty quick. If you roll it really well, you're either, you know, you're doing really good or you're doing really bad on that. If the check is a critical success, then the opportunity may be spent and fill 2 additional sections. So I like that critical successes can still be used in the clock scenario. Let's see here. That's pretty much how the clocks work. There's different examples in the book, right? So chasing a thief or trying to convince someone of something. Those are different scenarios where you can use the clock. But what we used in our entrance scenario was basically there's a bomb. It needs to be defused. You have to be successful to defuse it in the time that you have, which is, the 4 chances basically to pass that. We'll switch gears a little bit here, jumping into resting next. But after you've defused the bomb, you might be kind of tired, right? So you're going to need to take a rest. And also bring back in the bonds that I talked about earlier here. But resting, the way it works in this game is that if you're out in the wilderness or not in a settlement where you can safely sleep at night, then you can use something like a tent, right? And this is where those inventory points come in again. You can spend, I think it's 3 or however many it is, inventory points collectively to get a tent. All your player characters can use the same tent. So that counts as like a hardened shelter in a sense. Or if you are in civilization, you can either know somebody, sleep at a friend's house, for example, or you can purchase a room at the local inn like you would in many other tabletop role-playing games. But either way, as long as you secure your night's rest, it has to be 4 to 6 hours of resting, and this recovers all your hit points, all of your mind points, and cures you of any status effects. I'm gonna throw something out there if anybody knows what I'm talking about. But Final Fantasy IX is one of my favorite games, and I used to use the tents in that game like crazy. I'd always stock up on the tents because they were so broken. In combat, they're not useful, but out in the open world, you just use a tent whenever you want. You're fully healed. So uh, this feels very much like that, and I love Final Fantasy, and Fabula Ultima has all those vibes and more. Switching back into how the bonds work, this resting period is when you're going to be working on those bonds. This is where you have that downtime, like Fry mentioned in the scenes that you might have. This is more of like an interlude scene, right? When you're resting. This is your chance to bond with one of the other player characters. Maybe you share something about yourself or learn something about them. And then through that, you develop a bond to or with them. And you can tie that to whatever emotion it might be, right? If you're falling in love with them, it might be affection. If you're thinking really highly of them. It could be admiration, for example. And that's where you would mark a bond during that downtime. However, if you've already got your bonds played out, or maybe they're not flowing with the scenario as much as you like them, you can also change them. You just have to kind of be open about it, say why you think your characters changed their mind on this and what made them decide to switch that emotion that they had tied to that bond. Or you can just erase a bond completely if you're just wanting to replace it because you can only have 6, like I said. So maybe you picked one or set one and then it never worked out for you. Uh, but I really love that this resting and this downtime. There's other systems, right? I gotta say it. Daggerheart is one of the systems that is very popular lately, and we've been covering it as well. And that's what I really appreciate about that system as well as the downtime and how they really make that count, right? Because it's easy to sit around the table for 4 hours and you're just like, yep, we long rested and check and done. But I really like downtime and resting because that's when you can actually like role play a little bit and get to know characters and like things like that. So I really appreciate that in this system. And you're gonna need to rest when you're exploring the world or getting ready to do so. Fry, I'll throw it back to you for all that fun goodness.
All right, yes. So how we explore the world, right? We got our journeys and travels. So how journeying and travel works in this. So unless, like I said, unless you're in like a conflict scene or you're really zoomed in on the narrative and zoomed in on the characters and what they're doing, these are going to be more of like your interludes, and you're going to just basically be describing what's kind of going on throughout the travel day and all that. Whenever you are making your world map and like generating your world in that session 0, your game master is also going to decide how far you can travel in a day, right? You're kind of determining the scale of your map, so to speak. So you'll just uh, basically for every travel day, you'll be determining kind of what happens. You'll assess the threat level of the area. It does have a nice little guide here in the book, as always, on what a typical threat level is of a certain area. So, like if you're in a village, city, guarded town, anything like that, your threat level is going to be pretty minimum, all the way up to desert, frozen waste, jungles, volcanoes, very high threat level, very high chance of danger. And that is just going to determine the size of the die you use for your travel roll. So, the lowest being a d6, all the way up to a d20. Whenever you roll that die, on a 6 or higher, you encounter some kind of danger, something that presents itself in that area that you will have to handle. You might zoom back into that conflict scene, not necessarily always combat, but something will be having. Maybe that volcano does explode. And so now you're going to go through a little bit of a montage to figure out how you're going to get through that. And then if you roll a 1 on the die, you get a unexpected discovery. So this should be something positive. It may come from something negative, right? So maybe the discovery is you fall into a pit, fall into some kind of trap, right? Or fall into an unexpected area. So kind of sucks that you fell in, but maybe you find some really great treasure there. So the discovery should always be positive in the end whenever you roll that 1. And then you get to update your map sheet as you go along. So you get to every day of travel that if you found something great, you can mark it on your map. If you found a danger and you escaped, you want to come back later, you can mark it on your map as well. And then unless stopped by one of those dangers, you will just kind of keep proceeding to the next travel day. You kind of play those steps until you reach your destination. So I love that they have rules for travel. I think travel is one of the hardest things to get into a game and like get rules based around it that are good. They are simple, but I do appreciate that there's something in there. And again, they have kind of charts for everything. Even for the dangers, like I said, it doesn't have to be necessarily a combat. It could be extreme weather, poison swamp, things like that. And the game does tell you, hey, at certain level thresholds, depending on how you as the game master want this to play out. Maybe if you roll just the 6, the danger is minor damage, and it kind of gives you that chart. And if you roll the 20, and it's like kind of that bigger score, you want to do some more massive damage, it has charts for all that as well. So again, it doesn't always have to be combat, but I do love that they have kind of travel dangers kind of baked into it, even if it's as simple as, hey, you all take some damage because of this, and then we're going to move on to the next day. And then to round that out, of course, one of your discoveries can always be a dungeon itself, whether you come back to it later or you explore it right then and there. The does have dungeon rules there. This is where you get an additional scene called a dungeon scene. So this is if what more so matters about the dungeon is the end goal, right? What matters is what's in its depth. So you play your dungeon scene, just kind of like an interlude scene. You say, hey, highlight some key moments. You don't necessarily go through the dungeon inch by inch with like the map and everything, and you're kind of marking where everything is down to a T. This is just more so, hey, you find a dungeon, roll some checks. You guys travel over a pit. You guys make this jump, escape this trap, and this is what you get to at the end. Here's the conflict. Here's the treasure. Here's whatever. You can also do detailed exploration. This is where you bust out the map and everything. This one is what I would say for if you have a dungeon in your back pocket that you want them to go through, or maybe the dungeon is the goal. This isn't a discovery, right? This is, hey, you're going to the dungeon. This is where the detailed exploration is. This is where the nook and crannies and the actual detail of the dungeon matters to the story. And then finally, you can just run it as an interlude, single group check, just to see if you get through the obstacles or not before they reach the last room of the dungeon. So this is where I would do more like, hey, you kind of discovered it along the way. Dungeon master, hey, roll a quick check, hey, you get some treasure, okay, and we'll move on. So it does kind of have like foundations for different ways to explore a dungeon, and not always saying, hey, you need to prep this whole big mapped out scene and all that. Sometimes it's as simple as, hey, don't worry about it, run it as an interlude, give them a piece of treasure, give them a place to rest, give them something just minor and move on. Um, that is kind of the exploring, how you explore the world of Fabula Ultima, is you have your journeys and your travels, your dangers, your discoveries, and then a little bit of dungeon exploration, because what is a fantasy RPG without a little bit of dungeon exploring? But uh, with all that being said, you can't explore the world right without your team playing as a team, and I'll let Brown kind of round out how you take all this together and uh, use it as a team.
A lot of the things and concepts that we talked about in this chapter are that, right? Group checks and playing together, and even the clock scenario. Even if you're the one where the spotlight's on you, you're still doing this for the group, right? So if there's one thing I could really say about group dynamics, it would be relating this to Final Fantasy, for example. As you're traveling with these other player characters or playing with the people at your table, you're trying to get to know them, you're trying to support them, you're trying to do whatever their goals and aspirations might be. You're in this group and this party to help each other, and there's probably the big the BBEG that you're all after because he's done something different to all of you, right? That's really the concept of every tabletop role-playing game, to be honest. But I think the fantasy side in Fabula Ultima really captures that. There's numerous charts and ways to help you navigate through that. There's so many different things you can do as a group, and playing off those traits and bonds with each other and things like that is just so awesome. The Fabula points, the inventory points, even all of this is a way to play together but really enhance it. And this has some really unique mechanics in the system that you can use to really emphasize that. I will say in the book, the group dynamics, this is more like it reminds me of like a typical session zero. It kind of details some things that you want to be aware of at the table, like with these people that you're playing with, right? So it talks about a safe environment. It talks about mutual trust and respect, setting those boundaries of what is maybe in the clear to do during the sessions, or is maybe something you need to veil, is what this calls it. So things, that are sensitive subjects and topics that maybe everyone's not comfortable with, knowing those barriers and setting those up in advance, that helps you play more into that group dynamic, and you're able to role play collaboratively easier when you set those basics and those baselines from the beginning. I do appreciate that this book, it even has like pretty much a whole page talking about player versus player. It talks about if you have a conflict in game, right? Like take time to work that out. Don't use the game to like make a point personally against somebody through the game. That's something you don't want to do, obviously. But it also talks about establishing something that's that's at stake and determining a resolution method. It even makes reference to rolling against one another for it, like an opposed check. I think that's really funny that it's like if your characters are fighting about something, just bet some zenith on it and roll it out or something. So I think that was really cool. But there's 2 pages in here about group dynamics, but they're all more like basic stuff. But I just wanted to hit a couple of those points that this game works best, like most tabletop role-playing games, when you play together and you invest in each other and the other players at the table to make everyone's experience better. You're not playing this for yourself. You're playing this collaboratively with other people. Though you, as Tristan, for example, might have your own goals and values, you need to help your friends as well. That's going to wrap it up for this one. We truly appreciate you watching. Please like, comment, share, subscribe. We also do have memberships now as well if you're interested in that. And please keep an eye out for the next video, which will be chapter 3. And then we're going to have a couple more videos on Fabula Ultima after that. But until next time, keep that shield wall strong.